Right now, somewhere in the folds behind your eyes, a feeling is arriving before its time. Your brain doesn't experience time the way clocks do. Every moment you live passes through layers of processing, each one slightly behind the other. Sometimes a signal reaches the wrong layer first. The feeling of familiarity floods in before the moment has even finished forming. You stand inside a memory that hasn't been made yet. Welcome to the Sleepy Biologist. If you're listening while settling in for the night, thank you for being here. A gentle thank you to our channel members and everyone who's supported through Super Thanks. Your support keeps this space quiet and thoughtful. If you'd like to help, consider subscribing, leaving a like, or letting us know in the comments where you're listening from tonight. Now, let's move inward. There's something happening in your temporal lobe right now. Not dramatic, not loud, just signals, moving through tissue at different speeds. Your brain is comparing this moment to every moment you've ever stored, checking for matches, looking for patterns. Most of the time, this happens invisibly. The world touches your senses, and recognition follows at exactly the right distance. You see a face. A few milliseconds later, you know whose face it is. The gap is so small you never notice it existed. But sometimes the gap closes wrong. Imagine your brain as a place where signals arrive from everywhere at once. Light from your eyes, sound from your ears, the weight of your body against the surface beneath you. Each of these takes a different amount of time to become something you can notice. They travel different distances through different kinds of tissue. Some pathways are fast. Some are slow. Some take detours you'll never be aware of. Your hippocampus sits deep, receiving these signals and deciding what to do with them. It's encoding context. Where you are. What time it is. What this moment means in relation to all the others. But encoding takes time. And while it's working, the rest of your brain is already experiencing the moment. So the signal splits. One part of it goes to the place that says, "This is happening now." Another part goes to the place that says, "This has already been stored." And when they arrive too close together, your brain can't tell which came first. You might be standing in a hallway, ordinary light coming through a window, the smell of something you can't quite name, a sound in another room. Nothing remarkable. But suddenly, the entire moment feels like it's already happened. Not similar to something that happened, not reminding you of the past, but identical to a memory you don't actually have. This is your medial temporal lobe confusing sequence with repetition. The neurons that respond to familiarity are firing. They're supposed to fire when something matches a stored pattern. But they're not careful. They don't need a perfect match. They need resemblance. Enough overlap. Enough similarity in the shape of the signal. And so a moment that has never existed before feels like it's been lived already. Your brain is not malfunctioning. It's just that the systems meant to keep now separate from then are running on millisecond timing. And milliseconds are fragile. A slight delay, a moment of fatigue, a pathway that fires faster than usual. Any of these can shift the order just enough. The signal that should say, "This is new," arrives late. And the signal that should say, "Check for matches," arrives early. your brain receives them backward. And backward, in the language of memory, means before. You've probably felt this more in certain places. Generic rooms. Repeating architecture. Spaces designed to feel familiar, even when they're not. Your brain encodes these places with less detail, because there's less to hold on to. A beige hallway looks like every other beige hallway. A waiting room is just the idea of waiting rooms compressed into walls and chairs. So when you enter one, your hippocampus pulls up something vague, a memory that isn't specific. And vague memories match easily. Too easily. The system signals recognition, not because it remembers this exact place, but because it remembers something close enough. And close enough, to a brain that measures in resemblance, feels like certainty. There's another reason this happens. Your brain doesn't just record what's happening, it predicts what's about to happen. Constantly, without you asking it to. It's guessing the next word someone will say, the next movement your hand will make, the next sensation you'll feel. Most of the time, the prediction and the reality match closely enough that you don't notice the gap. But when a prediction lands too early, it gets confused with memory. What was anticipated becomes what was remembered. And so you stand in a moment that your brain has already imagined, and the imagining feels like déjà vu. You don't need to understand why this happens to feel it. You don't need to catch the signal mid-flight or trace the pathways it took. Your brain will continue comparing, encoding, predicting, without needing you to supervise. It has been doing this since before you could form sentences, since before you had language for time. Déjà vu is just one of the ways your brain shows you how much of experience is reconstruction, how little of memory is fixed, how easily the systems that separate now from then can blur at the edges. And maybe, in the gentlest way, it's a reminder that the line between experiencing something and remembering it was never as solid as it felt, that your mind holds time loosely, that signals arrive when they arrive, not when they're supposed to. The feeling will pass. It always does. And when it's gone, your brain will go back to its work, encoding the present, predicting the next moment, comparing everything to everything. But for now, you can rest in the strangeness of it, the way a moment can feel ancient and new at the same time, the way your brain can mistake a delay of milliseconds for a memory that spans years. Because deep in the folds of your temporal lobe, time is not a line. It's a network of signals, arriving out of order, overlapping, crossing paths in ways you'll never fully see. And sometimes, just sometimes, they cross in a way that lets you feel the machinery beneath the moment. The systems that hold your experience of time together are working right now. Even as you rest, even as your attention drifts. They'll keep working through the night, layering present over past, making sure most of the time you know which is which. And when they slip, when the timing breaks just slightly, you'll feel it again. That strange, quiet certainty that this has all happened before. Not because it has, but because your brain, for just a moment, believed it did. The world reaches you in stages. Light touches your retina. Sound enters your cochlea. Pressure registers against your skin. But none of these sensations arrive in your awareness at the same moment they occur. There's a gap between the world touching your body and your mind recognizing what touched you. Light enters your eyes. But the image builds slowly, constructed in stages you'll never notice. Your eyes are open right now, taking in whatever room or darkness surrounds you. And you might assume you're seeing it as it happens. That vision is immediate. But the photons striking the back of your eye begin a process that unfolds across time and distance. Those photons hit photoreceptor cells, rods and cones that convert light into electrical signals, and those signals travel along the optic nerve toward the visual cortex at the back of your skull. Already milliseconds have passed, and the image hasn't formed yet. The signal reaches the thalamus first, a relay station deep in your brain, and from there it splits into different streams, each one heading to a different processing area. One stream analyzes edges and shapes, another handles color, another tracks movement, and all of these streams work separately before they come back together into what you experience as seeing. The delay is brief, but it exists, and during that delay, the world continues moving forward while your brain is still assembling what just happened. This delay is longer for some senses than others. Touch, for instance, travels through your spinal cord before it reaches your brain, and the distance matters. If something brushes your toe, the signal has farther to travel than if something touches your cheek. Your brain compensates for this, adjusting the timing so that sensations seem to arrive together, but the compensation isn't perfect. Sometimes the adjustment miscalculates, and two things that happened at the same moment in the world arrive at different moments in your mind. You might feel the touch before you see the hand that touched you, or hear the sound before you register the movement that caused it. And in those moments, the order of events becomes uncertain. Most of the time, this delay is invisible because your brain is excellent at smoothing over the gaps, filling in the missing pieces so that experience feels continuous and coherent. It predicts what should come next and prepares the response before the signal fully arrives, which is why you can catch a ball without consciously calculating its trajectory, or pull your hand back from heat before you've fully registered the pain. The prediction runs ahead of awareness, and awareness follows, trusting that what it's experiencing matches what actually happened. But occasionally, the trust breaks down, and the delay becomes noticeable, and when it does, the brain struggles to reconcile the mismatch between when something occurred and when it was perceived. Déjà vu can emerge from this struggle. When two sensory streams finish processing at slightly different times, one pathway delivers the information labeled as present, and another, arriving just a fraction of a second later, delivers the same information, but through a route that touches memory structures first. The hippocampus receives the delayed signal and treats it as something already processed, something familiar, and so the same moment gets filed twice, once as now and once as before. You're not remembering the past. You're experiencing a single event that your brain has registered in two different temporal categories. And the confusion between those categories is what creates the uncanny feeling that this has happened already. The dual processing theory of déjà vu suggests that this is precisely what's occurring, that the brain's parallel pathways sometimes fall out of sync, and when they do, recognition arrives before the moment has finished being experienced. One part of your brain says this is new, another part says this is familiar, and both are responding to the same stimulus, but the mismatch in timing makes it feel like the familiar came first, like the memory preceded the experience. It's a glitch in sequencing, not a malfunction in memory, and it dissolves as soon as the pathways realign and the brain realizes it was responding to the same event twice. There's something else contributing to this delay, something less about speed and more about attention. Your conscious awareness can only hold a limited amount of information at any given time, so your brain filters aggressively, deciding what rises to the level of noticing and what stays in the background. But the background isn't silent. It's still being processed, still being encoded, just without your conscious participation. And sometimes, something that was processed in the background suddenly shifts into the foreground, and when it does, it carries with it a sense of familiarity because it was already encountered, even though you weren't aware of encountering it. the brain retrieves what it never fully attended to, and the retrieval feels like memory, like something from the past surfacing, when in fact it's just a moment ago resurfacing from the edges of your perception. This happens more often in environments that don't demand full attention, places where your mind is allowed to wander and sensory details drift in and out of focus without being fully processed. A quiet room, a familiar drive, a conversation you're only half listening to. In these moments, your brain is encoding information peripherally, storing fragments without assembling them into complete experiences. And then, when something pulls your attention back, when you suddenly focus on a detail that was already there, the brain recognizes it as familiar because it entered your system moments before. But the gap between the peripheral encoding and the focused recognition feels like the gap between past and present. The timing is compressed, but the feeling is stretched, and so a second ago feels like much longer. Your brain also has to contend with the fact that different types of information move at different speeds through different types of tissue. Myelinated neurons, wrapped in a fatty sheath that speeds transmission, carry signals faster than unmyelinated neurons, and the degree of myelination varies throughout the brain. Signals traveling through highly myelinated pathways can arrive significantly faster than signals traveling through older, slower pathways. And if both are carrying information about the same event, the first arrival gets processed and stored before the second arrival, even though both started at the same time. The second signal, arriving late, encounters a brain that has already encoded the event, and so it gets tagged as repetition, as recognition, as something that already occurred. The brain doesn't know the delay was internal. It assumes the delay means the event happened before, and so the present moment feels like a memory. Fatigue makes this worse. When you're tired, the speed of neural transmission slows, the efficiency of synaptic firing decreases, and the gaps between sensory input and conscious recognition widen. The brain still tries to maintain the illusion of continuity, still tries to align all the streams into a coherent timeline, but the alignment becomes sloppier, and moments that should feel simultaneous start to feel staggered. You might notice this as a general sense of detachment, a feeling that you're slightly behind your own experience, watching yourself move through the world rather than fully inhabiting the movement. And in that detachment, the boundary between experiencing and remembering thins, because both are happening at a remove, both are arriving late, and the brain can't easily distinguish between the two. This is not a failure of perception, it's a consequence of the architecture. Your brain was built in layers, older structures overlaid with newer ones, and those layers don't always communicate at the same speed. The limbic system, ancient and deeply embedded, processes emotion and memory quickly but imprecisely. The cortex, newer and more elaborate, processes sensory detail slowly but with greater accuracy. When both are responding to the same event, the emotional response often arrives first, colouring the experience before the details have fully formed. And that colouring can include a sense of familiarity that has nothing to do with whether the event has actually occurred before. The feeling precedes the facts, and by the time the facts arrive, the feeling has already shaped how they're interpreted. And so you can stand in a place you've never been, doing something you've never done, surrounded by people you've never met, and still feel the unmistakable certainty that you've been here before, that you've done this before, that you've already lived this exact moment. Not because you have, but because the timing of your brain's response has bent the sequence of events into something that resembles repetition. The delay has been mistaken for distance, and distance, in the language of memory, means the past. The moment will resolve itself without intervention. The pathways will synchronize, the streams will align, and the feeling of familiarity will dissolve as quickly as it appeared. Your brain will continue its work of turning the world into experience, adjusting for delays, compensating for gaps, building a timeline that feels smooth, even though it's constructed from fragments that arrive out of order. And you'll move forward, unaware of the constant recalibration happening beneath your awareness, the endless adjustments your brain makes to keep the present feeling like the present. But the gap remains. The delay between sensing and knowing. The space where the world has already touched you, but your mind hasn't caught up yet. That space is always there, invisible but persistent. And déjà vu is just one of the rare moments when you feel its presence. Your brain holds no perfect record of the past. What you remember is rebuilt each time, stitched together from fragments that may not fit. Recognition isn't about matching, it's about resemblance. A moment feels familiar not because it happened, but because something close enough once did. The edges blur, and certainty becomes a guess your mind makes without asking. Think of memory as a library where nothing stays on the shelf. Each time you reach for a book, you find only notes about what the book contained, and from those notes you reconstruct the pages, the chapters, the words you think were there. Sometimes the reconstruction is accurate, sometimes it's not. And you would never know the difference, because the reconstructed version is the only version you have access to. The original is gone. This is how your hippocampus and cortex work together. When something happens, the hippocampus binds the details, where you were, what you saw, how you felt, and stores an index, not the full experience. The sensory details live in different regions of cortex. Visual information in visual cortex, sound in auditory cortex, emotion in the amygdala. The hippocampus holds the links between these scattered pieces, and when you remember, it activates the pattern, pulling the pieces back together. But pulling them back together requires interpretation. The pieces don't come back unchanged. They've been influenced by everything that happened after the memory was formed. Other memories that resemble it, stories you've told about it, emotions you've attached to it since. Each time you remember, you're not accessing a file, you're creating a new version based on fragments and current context. And that new version gets stored again, replacing what was there before. Memory is reconstruction, not retrieval, and reconstruction relies on pattern matching. Your brain searches for similarities, for connections, for anything in the present that resembles something from the past. When it finds a match, even a partial one, it signals recognition. This is efficient. It allows you to navigate the world quickly, to respond to familiar situations without relearning everything from scratch. But efficiency comes at a cost. The system doesn't require precision. It settles for resemblance. Déjà vu exploits this tolerance for imprecision. When you enter a new situation that shares features with many previous situations, the pattern matching system activates. It finds overlaps, the angle of light through a window, the texture of a wall, the rhythm of voices in another room. None of these details perfectly match anything stored, but collectively they trigger a recognition signal. Your brain says, "This resembles something familiar." And resemblance, processed quickly, feels like familiarity, feels like memory. The library metaphor begins to dissolve here. Because unlike a library, where books are distinct and separate, your memories blur into each other. Similar experiences merge. Repeated patterns create templates. And what you remember isn't any single occurrence, but an averaged version of many occurrences, stripped of specifics, compressed into something general. If you've walked through many hallways in your life, your brain doesn't store each hallway separately. It creates a hallway template, average width, average lighting, average flooring, and when you walk through a new hallway, it compares the new one to the template. If the match is close enough, the brain signals familiarity. Not because you've been in this hallway before, but because this hallway fits the pattern of all hallways. The general has become confused with the specific. The template has been mistaken for a memory. This confusion intensifies in environments designed to be generic. Hotel rooms, office buildings, chain restaurants. These spaces are constructed to feel familiar, to match templates most people carry. And because they match so well, they trigger recognition signals more readily. You enter a hotel room you've never seen, and your brain says, "I know this place." Not because it remembers this room, but because it remembers the idea of hotel rooms. And this room is almost indistinguishable from that idea. The recognition happens before conscious thought, before you've had time to reason through whether you've actually been here. The signal arrives first, and by the time you're aware of it, the feeling is already present, already certain. And certainty is difficult to argue with, even when logic says the certainty is false. The feeling carries its own authority. Your brain also uses context to shape what feels familiar. If you're tired, if you're stressed, if you're in a state of mild anxiety, the threshold for triggering familiarity lowers. The pattern matching system becomes less selective. It accepts weaker matches. It finds resemblance where there might be none. This is protective in a way. When you're vulnerable, the brain wants to reassure you that the situation is known, that it has been navigated before, that you're not in completely unfamiliar territory, even if that reassurance is based on false resemblance. False resemblance is more common than you might think. Memory researchers have shown that people can remember events that never happened, can describe details that were never present, can feel absolutely certain about things that are demonstrably false. The brain isn't lying. It's reconstructing based on what seems plausible, what fits with other memories, what makes narrative sense. And plausibility feels like truth. Coherence feels like accuracy. When you experience déjà vu, you're feeling the output of this system operating at the edge of its tolerances. The pattern matching has found enough overlap to signal recognition, but not enough to provide actual details. You can't remember when this happened before. You can't recall the specifics. You only have the feeling, the sensation that this is not new. And that sensation, detached from detail, is the clearest evidence that familiarity and memory are not the same thing. Familiarity is a judgment your brain makes about pattern similarity. Memory is the reconstruction of a specific past event. Most of the time, these align. When something feels familiar, you can also retrieve details about when and where you encountered it before. But in déjà vu, the alignment breaks. Familiarity arrives without memory. The signal fires without being able to point to a source. And this creates the strange doubled sensation. I know this, but I don't know how I know this. The feeling fades because the brain continues evaluating. It keeps searching for the memory that should accompany the familiarity. When it fails to find one, when no specific past event surfaces to explain the recognition signal, the system recalibrates. It decides the match wasn't as strong as it initially thought. The familiarity weakens. The certainty dissolves. And the moment returns to feeling ordinary, new, appropriately unfamiliar. But while it lasts, déjà vu reveals something about how loosely your brain holds the distinction between past and present, how willing it is to accept resemblance as evidence, how quickly it can generate certainty from incomplete information. Your memory is not a recording, it's a process, a continual act of assembly, a best guess based on scattered traces. And most of the time, that's enough. Most of the time, the guess is close enough to what happened that you navigate the world effectively. But the system is built on approximation, built on templates and averages and pattern matching that doesn't require exactness. And so occasionally, it will tell you that you've been here before, that you've lived this moment already, that the present is somehow repeating. Not because it is, but because resemblance, in the architecture of memory, is close enough to truth. And you'll believe it. For a moment. Until the moment passes. Until the brain realizes its mistake and releases you back into the present. Back into the new. Back into what hasn't happened yet. Deep in the folds of your temporal lobe, neurons fire only when patterns repeat. They compare what's happening now to everything stored before. But these cells are not careful. They respond to similarity, not identity. A scent, an angle of light, the rhythm of a stranger's voice. Enough overlap, and the system signals, this has been lived before. These neurons live in a region called the perirhinal cortex. They sit near the hippocampus, but serve a different function. While the hippocampus handles context and spatial memory, the perirhinal cortex handles object recognition and familiarity judgments. It asks a simple question about everything you encounter. Have I experienced this before? The answer comes quickly. These cells fire strongly when something is novel, completely new. The firing rate is high, sharp, energetic. But as you encounter the same thing again, the firing decreases. The cells habituate. They grow quiet. This quieting is how your brain marks familiarity, not by remembering details, but by noticing the absence of surprise. Think of these neurons as sentries. They stand at the gate between sensation and recognition. Every stimulus passes through. Every face, every sound, every texture. The sentries measure each one against a threshold. New things cross the threshold and trigger activation. Familiar things fall below it and pass through quietly. Most of the time this works. You see a friend's face and recognition happens instantly. The perirhinal cortex stays quiet because the pattern matches stored experience. No alarm. No surprise. Just the smooth, automatic knowing that comes from repeated exposure. But the system measures resemblance, not exact matches. If you see someone who looks similar to your friend, the neurons respond with uncertainty. The pattern is close but not identical. The firing rate sits between novel and familiar. Ambiguous. And ambiguity in this system can tilt either direction. Sometimes it tilts toward familiarity when it shouldn't. A new situation carries elements that match old patterns. The shape of a room. The quality of afternoon light. The way shadows fall across a surface. Each element alone might not trigger recognition, but together they create a composite signal strong enough to cross the threshold. The perirhinal cortex quiets, and quieting means familiar, means known. The metaphor of sentries begins to fade here, because unlike guards who check credentials carefully, these neurons operate on probability. They don't verify. They estimate. And estimation allows for error. The cells use a process called pattern completion. When part of a pattern appears, the system fills in the rest automatically. If you hear the first 3 notes of a familiar song, your brain activates the entire melody. The missing notes exist in your mind, even though they haven't been played. This completion happens in the perirhinal cortex too. A partial match gets treated as a full match. The system completes what isn't there. This is efficient for genuine memories. You don't need to see every angle of your car to recognize it in a parking lot. A glimpse is enough. Pattern completion fills in the details. But in novel situations that contain familiar fragments, pattern completion can misfire. It fills in details that don't belong. It completes patterns that were never whole. And the completion feels like recognition. The feeling arrives before conscious evaluation. By the time you're aware you feel something is familiar, the perirhinal cortex has already made its determination, already sent its signal downstream, already labelled the moment as known. You can't argue with it, can't reason it away. The feeling carries the authority of neural fact. These neurons also respond to timing. The interval between exposures matters. See something once and then immediately again. The cells barely respond to the second encounter. They've just processed it. It's still in working memory. But if time passes, if the pattern fades from immediate awareness and then resurfaces, the cells must decide, is this new or returning? Usually they decide correctly. But if the timing is ambiguous, if the gap is neither immediate nor distant, the cells can misread the interval. They treat a recent experience as if it were older, as if it had been encountered before and forgotten. The signal says, this is returning, not continuing. And returning implies a gap, implies past. The perirhinal cortex doesn't work alone. It communicates constantly with the hippocampus. When familiarity fires in the perirhinal cortex, a query goes to the hippocampus. Where was this? When was this? What context surrounded this? The hippocampus searches for corresponding details, and if it finds them, familiarity becomes full recollection. But in déjà vu, the hippocampus finds nothing. The perirhinal cortex says familiar. The hippocampus says no matching context exists. The two regions send conflicting reports, and your conscious experience sits in the middle of that conflict. Certain this has happened, unable to say when. This mismatch doesn't last. The hippocampus continues searching. The perirhinal cortex continues evaluating. And as more information arrives, as the moment extends and new details accumulate, the weight of evidence shifts. The cells recognize the pattern isn't actually repeating. The familiarity signal weakens. The mismatch resolves, and the feeling fades. But while it persists, you're experiencing a direct readout of neural disagreement. One system says known, another says unknown. Both are correct in their own domain. The perirhinal cortex is correctly identifying pattern overlap. The hippocampus is correctly reporting no stored episode matches this context. Neither is malfunctioning. They're just measuring different things. These cells don't understand meaning. They don't interpret significance. They measure firing rates and compare them to thresholds. When rates drop, they signal familiar. When rates stay high, they signal novel. Everything else, the feeling of certainty, the sense of having lived this before, the emotional weight of recognition, those emerge from downstream interpretation, from your conscious mind trying to make sense of the signal it received. And so a cellular process becomes an experiential mystery. Neurons that simply measure pattern similarity create the subjective sensation of impossible memory. Cells that respond to resemblance generate the feeling of repetition. The biology is mechanical. The experience is uncanny. The perirhinal cortex will continue this work throughout your life, measuring every moment against every other, deciding what's new and what's returning, making thousands of familiarity judgments every day, most of them accurate, some of them uncertain, and occasionally, rarely, mistaking resemblance for repetition. And when it does, you'll feel it. That quiet insistence, that cellular certainty, that message from neurons that don't know they're wrong. This has already happened. You've been here before. Even though you haven't. Even though this is new. Even though the cells are only responding to overlap, not identity. The feeling remains, until the system corrects itself, until the mismatch resolves, until the present returns to feeling like the present. Your hippocampus stores context, the where and when of experience. but it works slowly, encoding details while you move through them. Sometimes the encoding finishes late, after the moment has already passed into awareness. The brain receives the same information twice, once as present, once as past. You exist briefly in both, and neither feels wrong. Imagine two photographs being placed on the same spot on a table. One is developing slowly in chemical solution. The other has already been printed and laid down. When you look at the table, you see both images at once, overlaid, neither fully obscuring the other. One is still forming. One already exists. And for a moment, you can't tell which came first. This is what happens in your medial temporal lobe during certain kinds of déjà vu. The hippocampus receives sensory information and begins the slow work of contextual encoding. It notes the spatial arrangement around you, the time of day, the emotional tone, the sequence of events. All of this gets woven into what researchers call an episodic memory, a memory of a specific moment that happened in a specific place. But episodic encoding takes time, seconds, sometimes longer. During those seconds, you're already experiencing the moment consciously, already seeing, hearing, feeling what's happening. The conscious experience arrives first. The encoded memory follows behind. And usually, this lag doesn't matter. By the time the encoding finishes, the moment has moved on to the next one. Except when it hasn't. Sometimes the encoding completes while you're still in the same situation, still standing in the same room, still engaged in the same conversation. And when the completed encoding arrives back in conscious awareness, it arrives labelled as memory, as something that already happened. Because to the hippocampus, it did already happen. It processed it, stored it, filed it away. So now your brain holds two versions of the same moment. One is the ongoing present experience, still unfolding in real time. The other is the completed memory, already packaged and stored. Both exist simultaneously in your awareness. Both feel real. And the temporal confusion this creates, the sense that you're experiencing something and remembering it at the same time, that's déjà vu. The metaphor of overlaid photographs begins to dissolve now into something more precise. Your hippocampus has two main regions, CA1 and CA3. These areas process incoming information in slightly different ways and at slightly different speeds. CA3 is faster, more reactive. It quickly binds together the elements of an experience, sights, sounds, spatial details, into a preliminary pattern. CA1 works more slowly, more carefully, integrating that pattern with existing memories and refining the encoding. Usually these regions work in sequence. CA3 creates the initial binding, then hands it off to CA1 for consolidation, and by the time CA1 finishes, you've moved on to a new moment. The completed memory gets stored without interfering with ongoing experience. Past and present stay separate. But if something disrupts the timing, if CA1's processing happens faster than usual, or CA3's happens slower, the handoff can occur while the original experience is still active. The signal loops back. The memory of the moment resurfaces while the moment is still being lived. And this creates a strange temporal doubling. You're inside the event and simultaneously recalling it. Present and past occupy the same experiential space. This isn't speculation. Researchers have observed similar patterns in laboratory settings. When they stimulate the hippocampus during memory formation, participants report feeling like the current moment has already happened. The stimulation accelerates the encoding process, causing the memory to complete while the experience is still ongoing. The brain registers both the live event and the stored version, and consciousness can't reconcile the overlap, so it defaults to the interpretation that makes intuitive sense. This happened before. Time in the hippocampus is not linear. It doesn't move in one direction like a clock. It moves in cycles, in loops, in patterns that fold back on themselves. The hippocampus is constantly comparing what's happening now to what happened before, searching for matches, for similarities, for ways to connect the present to the past. And sometimes, in that constant comparison, the boundary between present and past blurs. There's another layer to this. The hippocampus doesn't just encode individual moments, it also creates predictions about what will happen next. Based on patterns it has learned, it generates expectations, and those expectations prime your perception. You walk into a familiar type of space, a classroom, a grocery store, a friend's kitchen, and your hippocampus predicts what you'll encounter, where the door will be, what sounds you'll hear, what objects will appear. When the predictions match reality closely, the hippocampus registers less surprise. The encoding becomes easier, faster, because it's filling in a template rather than creating something new. But sometimes, the template gets confused with actual memory. The prediction feels like recollection. What the brain expected to happen gets mistaken for what already did happen. And so you experience the present as a repetition. Not because it's repeating, but because your brain predicted it so accurately that prediction and memory became indistinguishable. The two photographs are still there on the table, one developing, one complete. But now you notice something else. The completed photograph isn't showing what you thought it was. It's showing what your brain expected to see, not what was actually captured. The developing image reveals the truth slowly, detail by detail. And as it does, the mismatch becomes clear. The overlap dissolves. This is how déjà vu ends in these cases. The hippocampus continues processing. More details accumulate. The differences between the predicted pattern and actual reality become undeniable. The system realizes the match was false, that what felt like memory was actually expectation, or incomplete encoding, or temporal misalignment. The feeling releases. The present separates from the past. But during the overlap, you inhabited both states simultaneously. You were living through something and remembering it at the exact same moment. Not remembering it from another time, but remembering it from now, from the encoding that was happening while the experience unfolded. Your brain showed you its own process, usually invisible, usually hidden beneath the smooth surface of consciousness. The hippocampus will keep doing this work, encoding context, building memories, comparing past to present, making predictions. Most of the time, the timing will be clean. The memory will form after the moment ends. The separation will hold, but occasionally, rarely, the process will loop back on itself. The encoding will finish too soon, or the prediction will feel too much like memory. And for a brief, disorienting interval, two versions of the same moment will exist in the same space. One still forming, one already formed. And you'll stand between them, unable to tell which is which. Present and past, overlaid like photographs, both visible, both real, both claiming to be the moment you're living. Until the overlap clears, until the encoding finishes fully, until the hippocampus sorts present from memory again, and the doubled moment becomes singular once more. You can't fully attend to everything at once. Your focus narrows, and the rest fades into background processing. Dimmer, quieter, less detailed. Sometimes that background suddenly sharpens. What was ignored a second ago resurfaces as though it happened before. The brain retrieves what it never properly recorded, and the confusion feels like proof. Right now, there are sounds around you that you weren't noticing until this moment. The hum of electrical current somewhere distant, the movement of air through a vent, maybe the settling of the building itself or the faint pressure of fabric against your skin. All of these sensations existing continuously, but sliding past your awareness without landing, without being held, without rising to the threshold where noticing becomes knowing. Your brain processes them anyway, filing them peripherally, encoding just enough to mark their presence, but not enough to bring them into full conscious view. And this peripheral encoding, this half attention that operates constantly beneath your focused awareness, creates a strange archive of moments you experienced, but never quite lived. Attention is not binary. It's not simply on or off, present or absent, focused or wandering. It exists in gradations, in layers of intensity and clarity that shift continuously, depending on what your brain decides matters most in any given second. At the center is whatever you're actively thinking about, the object of your direct focus, receiving the full resources of your conscious processing. Surrounding that center are concentric rings of diminishing attention, each one holding information less clearly, less completely, until at the outermost edges, sensory data arrives and departs without ever quite cohering into experience. You're aware of these outer rings only when something within them suddenly demands attention, pulling itself from background to foreground, from vague to sharp. And when that happens, when something ignored resurfaces into focus, it often carries with it a peculiar quality, a feeling that you've encountered it before, even though you only just noticed it. Think of attention as a spotlight moving across a dark stage, where many things are happening simultaneously in different areas, some brightly lit, others barely visible in the scattered glow that reaches beyond the main beam. The spotlight can only illuminate one region at a time with full intensity, though the surrounding areas remain dimly perceptible, enough to register movement or shape, but not enough to capture detail. Most of the action on this stage happens outside the spotlight's direct path, processed just enough to be catalogued, but not enough to be truly seen. And occasionally the spotlight swings suddenly to an area it had been ignoring, revealing something that was already there, already happening, already encoded at low resolution in your peripheral awareness. The revelation feels like recognition, because in a sense it is. You're recognizing something your brain already knew about, but hadn't yet brought into focus. Déjà vu can emerge from exactly this mechanism, from the moment when peripheral processing suddenly becomes central, and the brain misinterprets the transition as temporal rather than spatial, as a shift in time rather than a shift in attention. You were in a conversation, focused on the words being spoken, when something in your visual field, a pattern of light on the wall, the arrangement of objects on a nearby table, the angle at which someone was standing, existed in your peripheral awareness without being consciously noted. Your brain encoded it lightly, marked its presence, stored a faint trace of the pattern. Then, seconds or minutes later, your attention shifts, and you look directly at that same arrangement, now bringing it into full focus, and the brain recognizes the pattern from the peripheral trace it stored moments before. But because the initial encoding was so light, so vague, so unanchored to a specific moment of noticing, the recognition arrives without context, without a clear timestamp, and the brain defaults to the interpretation that this pattern must belong to an earlier time, to a previous experience, rather than to a moment ago when it was simply being ignored. The feeling of pastness is actually the feeling of peripheral encoding being retrieved and mistaken for full memory. This happens more readily in environments where your attention is divided by design, where multiple streams of information compete for processing resources and nothing quite captures your full focus. A busy street where you're navigating traffic, while also listening to music, while also thinking about something unrelated, creates exactly this kind of fragmented attention, where sensory details register partially, incompletely, scattered across different levels of awareness. Your brain is taking in the storefronts you pass, the faces of pedestrians, the rhythm of footsteps, the changing light between buildings, but none of these elements receive sustained attention. None get encoded with enough clarity to form distinct memories. They exist instead as atmospheric data, as background texture, processed just enough to keep you oriented, but not enough to become memorable. And then one of these peripheral elements suddenly demands focus. Perhaps you need to read a street sign or avoid a collision, and your attention crashes down onto something your brain had been monitoring loosely for several seconds already. And the crash feels like return, like coming back to something rather than arriving at it for the first time. The metaphor of the spotlight dissolves here into something more mechanistic, more directly biological. Your prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for directing attention, operates with limited capacity. It can only maintain a small number of items in active working memory simultaneously, typically around 4 distinct elements, though this varies depending on complexity and familiarity. Everything else that enters your sensory system gets processed by other regions, particularly the parietal cortex, which handles spatial awareness, and the temporal cortex, which manages object recognition. And these regions continue operating even when prefrontal attention is directed elsewhere. They're still encoding, still comparing incoming patterns to stored templates, still making judgments about novelty and familiarity, but their conclusions remain beneath conscious awareness until prefrontal resources become available to examine them. This creates a backlog of processed but unexamined information, sensory data that has been evaluated for significance but not yet consciously noted. And when the prefrontal cortex finally shifts attention to these backlogged items, it retrieves them from a temporary holding space where they've been waiting, sometimes for several seconds, to be acknowledged. The retrieval feels like memory retrieval, because structurally it is. The brain is pulling information from storage, but the storage was so recent, so fleeting, that it shouldn't trigger the kind of familiarity associated with long-term memory, yet sometimes it does. And that misattribution creates the temporal confusion characteristic of déjà vu. There's also the phenomenon of inattentional blindness to consider, which demonstrates how completely your brain can fail to register something that's directly in front of you when your attention is occupied elsewhere. In experiments, people watching a video and counting basketball passes often fail to notice someone in a gorilla suit walking through the scene, because their attention is so tightly focused on the counting task that other visual information, even something as absurd and obvious as a person in a gorilla costume, never reaches conscious awareness. The sensory data enters the visual system, travels through the retina and optic nerve, gets processed in early visual cortex, but somewhere along the pathway to consciousness, it gets filtered out, deemed irrelevant to the current attentional goal, and therefore blocked from reaching working memory. But that early processing still happens, still leaves traces, still activates neurons that respond to shape and movement and unexpected elements in the visual field. And if immediately after the gorilla passes, if someone points to that area of the scene and asks what you saw there, you might experience a strange flicker of familiarity, a sense that something happened in that space, even though you can't consciously recall seeing anything, because the peripheral processing occurred, registered the anomaly, stored a faint signal that attention never amplified into full awareness. That faint signal, when retrieved, carries a whisper of recognition, without the accompanying detail that would explain where the recognition came from. Your brain is constantly making decisions about what to amplify and what to suppress, what to bring into focus and what to leave hovering at the edges. And these decisions happen automatically, without conscious input, guided by learned priorities and evolutionary biases that favor certain types of information over others. Movement over stillness, faces over objects, threats over neutral stimuli. The suppressed information doesn't disappear, though. It continues existing in a reduced state, processed enough to be available if needed, but not enough to occupy the limited space of conscious attention. and this creates a perpetual mismatch between what you're aware of experiencing and what your brain is actually encoding. A gap that usually remains invisible because the two streams, conscious attention and peripheral processing, stay separated. One loud and clear, the other quiet and diffuse. But when the separation fails, when something pulls peripheral content suddenly into conscious focus, the two streams collide and the brain struggles to integrate them coherently, struggles to assign proper temporal tags to information that was processed at one time but noticed at another. The struggle manifests as déjà vu, as the uncanny feeling that this moment of noticing is actually a moment of returning, of coming back to something already experienced, when in fact you're just seeing clearly for the first time what was already there, waiting in the periphery of your awareness. The feeling fades as attention stabilizes, as the prefrontal cortex gathers more information about the current moment and builds a coherent narrative that places this experience firmly in the present rather than the past. The peripheral trace that triggered the familiarity gets overwritten by new, fuller encoding, by details accumulated through sustained attention that clearly mark this as a new event, a first encounter rather than a repetition. The brain corrects its temporal attribution, realizes the recognition came from seconds ago rather than days or weeks, and the sense of impossible memory dissolves. What remains is just the ordinary present, no longer doubled, no longer haunted by the ghost of peripheral processing mistaken for distant recall. But for those few seconds when the confusion held, when attention crashed down onto something it had been ignoring and mistook retrieval for remembering, you inhabited a strange split state where the present felt simultaneously new and old, where something you were seeing for the first time with full attention carried the unmistakable sensation of being seen before, not because it had been seen before in any meaningful sense, but because your brain had been watching it peripherally, encoding it lightly, holding it in the background, waiting for attention to arrive and claim it. And when attention finally came, the claiming felt like reclaiming. The noticing felt like re-noticing. And the present, just for a moment, felt like the past. Signals in your brain don't travel at the same speed. Some take shortcuts through white matter highways. Others wind slowly through older, slower tissue. When the same piece of information arrives twice, separated by milliseconds, the second arrival feels like an echo. But echoes belong to the past. Your mind interprets lateness as previousness, and the present becomes its own ghost. You can feel this sometimes without naming it. A sound reaches your ears and you turn toward it, but there's a gap, thin, almost invisible, between hearing and recognizing, between the raw sensation and the interpretation. That gap exists because different parts of your brain process at different speeds. Your auditory cortex receives the sound first, raw, uninterpreted, just frequency and amplitude and timing. Then the signal splits. One pathway analyzes what the sound is. Another pathway checks if you've heard it before. Both pathways use different neural tissue. Both travel different distances. The pathway that identifies the sound moves through unmyelinated axons, bare neural fibers, exposed, slow. These are ancient structures, evolutionarily old. They conduct signals at perhaps 1 meter per second, sometimes slower. The pathway that checks for familiarity runs through myelinated fibers. These are wrapped in fatty insulation, protected, fast. They conduct at 50, sometimes 100 meters per second, nearly instantaneous across the short distances inside your skull. A signal that starts at the same point, traveling along these different pathways, arrives at vastly different times. Usually your brain compensates. It waits for the slower signal, holds the faster one in temporary storage, then integrates both when they're ready. The conscious experience you have feels unified, seamless. But underneath, your brain is constantly juggling signals that arrive out of sequence, adjusting their timestamps, aligning them artificially so experience feels coherent. Sometimes the adjustment fails. The fast pathway delivers its verdict, familiar, known, recognized, before the slow pathway has finished identifying what's actually being experienced. Your brain receives recognition before it receives the thing being recognized. The order reverses. And reversed order, in neural terms, suggests the thing being recognized came first, came before, happened in the past. This is happening with more than just sound. Visual information splits too, into dorsal and ventral streams. The dorsal stream, where things are, how they're moving, runs fast. The ventral stream, what things are, what they mean, runs slower. When you glance at something, your brain knows where it is before it knows what it is. Location arrives first. Identity follows. Most of the time this doesn't create confusion. But if the ventral stream is delayed, fatigued, slightly compromised, the gap widens. And during that wider gap, the dorsal stream might loop its information back through memory systems, checking for matches, looking for similar spatial configurations you've encountered before. It finds something close, signals familiarity. Then the ventral stream arrives with object identity, and your conscious mind receives them in the wrong order. Familiarity first, recognition second. It feels like you knew this before you saw it, which is impossible. But the feeling doesn't care about possibility. The feeling follows the order of neural arrival, and that order says, this is known. The variation in conduction speed isn't random. It's structural, built into the architecture. Myelination develops unevenly across childhood and adolescence. Some pathways finish maturing early, others don't complete until your mid-20s, and even then, the degree of myelination varies. Some axons remain partially unmyelinated. Some regions rely on older, slower connections. Your brain is not uniformly fast. It's a patchwork of speeds. When you're rested, the patchwork functions well. The timing differences are small enough that compensation works. The delays stay hidden. Everything feels synchronized. When you're tired, the patchwork shows its seams. Synaptic transmission slows. Neurotransmitter recycling becomes less efficient. The fast pathways stay relatively fast, but the slow pathways get slower. The gap between them widens, and in that widening gap, signals start arriving in noticeably wrong orders. You might notice this as a general fogginess, a sense that the world is slightly delayed, that you're watching yourself from a distance, that reactions take longer than they should. This is your brain struggling to synchronize pathways that are drifting apart. And within that struggle, déjà vu can emerge more easily, because the system that checks for familiarity, that fast-conducting, heavily myelinated system, is still running ahead of the system that builds full conscious awareness. There's no metaphor here that makes this clearer, just neural tissue conducting electricity at different speeds. Just pathways that diverge and reconverge. Just timing. But timing is everything in the brain. A few milliseconds of delay, a signal arriving too early or too late, that's enough to change what something feels like. Enough to make the present feel like the past. Enough to create certainty where there should be novelty. The pathways will continue doing this, splitting signals, conducting at different speeds, arriving out of sequence. Your brain will continue compensating, adjusting, aligning, making the experience feel unified even when the underlying processes are fragmented. And most of the time it will succeed. The delays will stay invisible. The timing will feel right. The present will feel present. But occasionally, rarely, the timing will slip. The fast pathway will outpace the slow one by just enough. The signal will arrive twice, once as new, once as familiar. And in the space between those two arrivals, you'll feel it. That impossible recognition, that echo without a source, that sense that the moment is repeating. Not because it is, but because your brain heard it twice. Once on the fast path, once on the slow path, and mistook the delay for distance, mistook lateness for pastness, and the present became its own echo. Your mind doesn't wait for the world to happen, it guesses ahead. Predictions run constantly, comparing what should occur with what actually does. Most of the time, reality matches closely enough that you don't notice the gap. But when a prediction lands too early, the match feels backward. What was anticipated becomes what was remembered, and the timeline folds in on itself. Even now, as you rest here, your brain is generating predictions about what will happen in the next second, the next breath, the next shift of your body against the surface beneath you. And these predictions aren't conscious thoughts, but quiet neural calculations running perpetually in regions like your cerebellum and basal ganglia, structures designed to model the immediate future so that when it arrives, you're already prepared to respond, without the delay that conscious deliberation would require. Your brain predicts the weight of your arm before you lift it, the texture of a surface before your fingers make contact, the sound of your own voice before you speak. And when these predictions match reality closely, the match goes unnoticed because matching is the default state, the expected outcome, the thing your predictive systems are calibrated to achieve thousands of times every day without fanfare or awareness. But predictions can also mismatch. They can arrive too early, or be too specific, or align with reality in ways that create confusion rather than clarity. And when a prediction about the future accidentally gets filed as memory of the past, when the anticipatory signal gets tagged with the wrong timestamp, the present moment becomes unmoored from its proper place in time and floats somewhere between what's happening and what was expected to happen. And that floating state is often what déjà vu feels like from the inside. Consider what happens when you're walking down a hallway in an unfamiliar building, but the hallway resembles many other hallways you've walked through before. Your brain doesn't approach it as entirely novel because it carries a template of hallwayness built from years of similar experiences. And that template includes predictions about what will appear as you move forward, where doorways should be, how the lighting will change, what sounds will echo off the walls. These predictions generate quietly. Your visual cortex and parietal lobe work together to extrapolate from what you can see to what you expect to see next, building a model of the space that extends slightly beyond your current perception. And this model helps you navigate smoothly without having to stop and consciously evaluate every detail. But the model is based on past experience, on patterns extracted from memory, so it carries within it traces of all the hallways you've ever known. And sometimes those traces become too vivid, too present, bleeding into your perception of the current hallway in ways that make the new space feel like it's repeating an old one. The prediction and the perception merge. What you expected to see becomes indistinguishable from what you're actually seeing. And because predictions are based on memory, the merge creates a sensation that memory is somehow preceding experience, that you're walking through something you've already walked through, even though you're walking through it for the first time, while your brain is simply very good at predicting what walking through hallways tends to involve. Predictions operate at multiple timescales, from milliseconds to minutes, with different brain regions handling different temporal windows. Your motor cortex predicts what your muscles will do in the next tenth of a second. Your prefrontal cortex predicts what conversation topic might come up in the next 30 seconds. Your hippocampus predicts what kind of environment you'll encounter when you turn the next corner, based on contextual cues gathered over the past several minutes. All of these predictions run in parallel. They overlap and influence each other. And most importantly, they're not passive guesses, but active simulations that your brain treats almost like actual experiences, firing many of the same neural patterns that would fire if the predicted event were actually occurring, which is why imagining biting into a lemon can make your mouth water, or thinking about running can slightly elevate your heart rate, even though you're sitting still. The brain doesn't always distinguish clearly between simulating and experiencing, between predicting and perceiving, and this blurriness becomes especially pronounced in the hippocampus, where memory storage and future simulation activate overlapping neural networks. The same cells that help you remember yesterday also help you imagine tomorrow. And when those cells fire, it's not always clear whether they're firing because something is being recalled or because something is being anticipated. So when you enter a situation that your brain has strong predictions about, when the contextual cues trigger a detailed simulation of what should happen next, the simulation can feel like memory simply because it's using memory systems to generate itself, borrowing patterns and details from past experiences to construct a model of the immediate future. And if the model is vivid enough, if it captures enough detail, it can create the uncanny sensation that you've lived this moment before, even though what you're actually experiencing is your brain's confidence in its own predictions. The more familiar the context, the more detailed the predictions become. A routine commute generates hundreds of micro-predictions. Each traffic light, each turn, each landmark passes through your awareness with a kind of pre-recognition, an expected quality that makes everything feel slightly less immediate, slightly less present, because your brain is encountering what it already simulated moments before. Usually this feels like fluency, like smooth navigation through known territory. But sometimes it tips over into something stranger, a feeling that the fluency isn't coming from good prediction, but from actual repetition, from having travelled this exact route in this exact way, with these exact thoughts at some earlier time that you can't quite locate, but feel certain existed. There's a region in your medial prefrontal cortex that's particularly involved in this predictive process, constantly generating expectations about upcoming events based on learned patterns and current context. And when those expectations are met, the region shows decreased activity, because met expectations require less processing than violations. The brain essentially conserves energy when reality confirms its models. But when expectations are violated, the region activates strongly to update the model and learn from the mismatch. Déjà vu might emerge from a state where expectations are being met so precisely that the decreased activity gets misinterpreted as familiarity rather than accurate prediction, where the brain's response to a well-predicted moment resembles its response to a well-remembered moment, both characterized by low surprise, low processing demands, a smooth integration of incoming information with existing knowledge. The feeling of recognition in both cases is similar. The neural signature is similar. And if the brain misattributes the cause, if it mistakes predictive success for memorial retrieval, the result is a conviction that this moment has occurred before, when actually this moment is occurring exactly as predicted, which isn't the same thing, but can feel identical from the inside. Predictions also create what researchers call perceptual expectations, subtle biases in how you process sensory information that make you more likely to perceive what you expect to perceive rather than exactly what's present. A phenomenon demonstrated in countless experiments where people fail to notice changes or anomalies in their environment when those changes violate strong predictions, the brain essentially filling in expected details rather than carefully analyzing actual details, which is efficient but error-prone. In everyday life, this means you might walk into your kitchen and not notice that a familiar object has been moved because your prediction about where it should be is strong enough to override the contradictory visual input, at least initially, until focused attention corrects the error. But in that brief moment before correction, you experienced a predicted reality rather than actual reality. You saw what should have been there instead of what was there. And if this happens not with objects but with entire scenes, entire configurations of space and light and atmosphere, the predicted reality can feel so complete, so detailed, that when the actual reality aligns with it, the alignment feels like confirmation of memory rather than confirmation of prediction. You predicted you would see this. Your prediction was correct. But the correctness gets interpreted as having seen this before, and the temporal confusion that creates is déjà vu in one of its most common forms. Your brain is especially prone to this confusion during periods of high cognitive load or distraction, when conscious monitoring of predictions versus perceptions is diminished, and the system runs more automatically, more reflexively, with less oversight from executive functions that might catch and correct temporal misattributions. If you're tired, stressed, thinking about something else while moving through space, your predictive systems continue operating, but the feedback loops that normally check their outputs against reality become less reliable. Predictions go unchallenged for slightly longer, and in that slightly longer interval, they have more opportunity to be mistaken for actual experiences rather than anticipated ones. The prediction runs. Reality confirms it. But the confirmation happens a fraction of a second late, after the prediction has already begun to feel like established fact rather than tentative guess. And when confirmation arrives, it reinforces the feeling that this was known, was certain, was already experienced, rather than revealing that it was merely well predicted. There's something almost circular about this mechanism, the way memory creates predictions which feel like memories when they're confirmed, the way the future borrows from the past, and then returns to the past when the future arrives. A loop that usually stays hidden, but occasionally becomes perceptible as déjà vu, as a moment when the circle closes in a way you can feel, when prediction and memory and perception converge so tightly that distinguishing between them becomes impossible, and time itself seems to fold back on itself. The circularity resolves eventually. New information accumulates. Details emerge that weren't in the prediction. The brain recognizes the mismatch and reclassifies the experience as present rather than past, as predicted rather than remembered. The déjà vu fades. But while it lasted, you inhabited that circular space, where your mind's anticipation of what would happen next became indistinguishable from your memory of what had happened before, where the future you were predicting felt identical to a past you were certain existed, even though the past was actually just the prediction itself, fed back through memory systems and misidentified as retrieval, when it was really just very accurate forecasting. Your brain guessed right. It guessed so right that the guess felt like knowledge, felt like history. And for a moment the present was neither new nor old, but something in between, something predicted and remembered simultaneously, a moment that existed in your mind before it existed in time. The predictions continue. Your brain keeps guessing, keeps modelling the next second, the next sensation. And most of the time the guesses stay where they belong, in the future, in anticipation, in the realm of what might happen next, rather than what already happened before. But occasionally the boundary blurs, and a prediction crosses into memory, and you feel again that impossible certainty, that sense that the moment unfolding now has unfolded before, not because it has, but because your brain predicted it would unfold exactly this way, and the prediction was so accurate that accuracy became indistinguishable from repetition. The timeline folded. The present felt like the past. And for a brief, disorienting moment, your mind's ability to guess ahead became your mind's conviction that it had already been here. When you're tired, the systems that keep time organized begin to drift. The part of your brain that marks now from then requires energy to stay precise. As that energy fades, borders weaken. Old memories surface without context. New experiences settle into places they don't belong, and the separation between experiencing and recalling dissolves without announcement. Think of your brain's temporal organization as a series of filing cabinets, each drawer labeled with a different time period, each folder within those drawers containing experiences sorted by context and emotional weight. The system maintained by a diligent archivist who works continuously to ensure everything stays in its proper place. that yesterday's events remain in yesterday's drawer, and this morning's thoughts don't drift into last week's memories. This archivist is your prefrontal cortex, working in coordination with your hippocampus, spending metabolic resources to maintain boundaries, to timestamp experiences accurately, to keep the timeline coherent even as thousands of new memories arrive daily, requiring classification and storage. When you're well rested, the archivist works efficiently, filing things correctly, retrieving them when needed, maintaining the distinctions that allow you to know with certainty what happened when. But when you're exhausted, the archivist slows down, makes errors, sometimes stops bothering to label things carefully, and the filing system begins to blur. Drawers left open, folders misplaced, boundaries between time periods growing thin and permeable. Sleep deprivation affects neural function in specific, measurable ways that directly compromise temporal processing. Your prefrontal cortex, which requires more energy than almost any other brain region due to its complex integrative functions, shows decreased activity after even moderate sleep loss. Glucose metabolism drops in this area first, before other regions, because the prefrontal cortex operates at such high metabolic demand that any reduction in available energy causes noticeable functional decline. And among its many functions, the prefrontal cortex is responsible for what's called temporal tagging, the process of marking when something happened relative to other events, creating the sequential structure that allows you to distinguish today from yesterday from last year. When prefrontal function declines, temporal tagging becomes less accurate. Events start losing their precise timestamps. Memories float more freely through time. The hippocampus also suffers under fatigue, though differently. This structure doesn't just store memories, but actively replays them during rest, strengthening some connections while weakening others, consolidating important experiences into long-term storage while allowing trivial details to fade. This replay normally happens during specific sleep stages, particularly during slow-wave sleep and REM sleep, when the hippocampus communicates with the cortex to transfer and organize information. When you're sleep-deprived, this consolidation process is disrupted, incomplete, leaving memories in an unstable state where they're partially encoded but not fully integrated. These unstable memories are more likely to be triggered inappropriately, surfacing during waking hours when they shouldn't, bleeding into current perception because they haven't been properly filed away. It's as though the filing cabinet drawers were left partially open, contents visible and accessible when they should be closed and dormant, and the exposed memories can contaminate new experiences with feelings of familiarity that have no clear source. As the metaphor of filing cabinets begins to dissolve into something more biological, consider what happens at the cellular level when neurons are fatigued. Synaptic transmission, the process by which one neuron communicates with another, requires neurotransmitters to be released, cross a tiny gap, bind to receptors, then be cleared away and recycled for the next transmission. This cycle consumes energy. When energy supplies run low, the recycling process slows. Neurotransmitter concentrations in synapses become irregular. Some synapses fire more weakly, while others fire unpredictably, and the overall reliability of neural signaling decreases. In the circuits responsible for temporal processing, this unreliability means that signals marking the present moment might be weaker than usual, while signals retrieving past moments might fire more readily, because retrieval pathways, being well established and frequently used, require less energy to activate than the active encoding of new information. The result is a state where past and present exist on more equal footing than they should. Normally, the present dominates your awareness, because encoding new information is an active, energy-intensive process that captures attention and neural resources. The past remains quiet in storage, retrieved only when deliberately sought or when strong cues trigger recall. But when fatigue weakens the encoding of present experience, while leaving retrieval mechanisms relatively intact, the balance shifts. Past memories become more accessible, more intrusive, more likely to surface spontaneously. And when they surface alongside weakly encoded present experiences, the two can merge, with the present feeling less vivid and immediate, while the past feels more present and insistent. This merging creates ideal conditions for déjà vu. You're experiencing something new, but your brain is encoding it weakly, without the usual strength of signal that marks something as definitively present, definitively now. Simultaneously, similar past experiences are surfacing more readily than usual, because the suppression mechanisms that normally keep memories dormant unless needed are also compromised by fatigue. The weak present encoding encounters the inappropriately active past memory, and your brain struggles to distinguish between them. Which one is now? Which one is then? The temporal tags are unclear, the boundaries are thin, and in that confusion, the brain sometimes defaults to the interpretation that both belong to the past, that the current experience is actually a remembered experience, producing the characteristic feeling of déjà vu, where something definitely happening right now feels like something that definitely happened before. There's also the matter of attention, which fatigue degrades significantly. When you're alert, attention acts as a spotlight that illuminates the present moment clearly, marking it as the focus of current processing and helping distinguish it from background mental activity. When you're tired, that spotlight dims and wavers, sometimes failing to mark the present moment with sufficient clarity. The dimmed present can feel dreamlike, detached, less real than usual, which is a state similar to how memories feel, somewhat distant, somewhat vague, experienced at one remove from immediate sensory vividness. So the tired present begins to resemble memory, not because it's actually being confused with a specific past event, but because fatigue makes it feel the way memories generally feel, creating a qualitative similarity that the brain can misinterpret as temporal similarity. Studies have shown that people report more frequent déjà vu experiences during periods of high stress and low sleep, confirming that the phenomenon has roots in the physiological state of the brain rather than being purely a memory glitch. Stress and fatigue both compromise the same neural systems: prefrontal executive function, hippocampal consolidation, the precision of temporal tagging, creating conditions where the boundaries between different time periods become more permeable. It's not that stressed or tired people remember things incorrectly, but rather that the mechanisms keeping past and present separated require resources that stress and fatigue deplete, and without those resources, the separation becomes harder to maintain. Time starts to feel less linear, more fluid, with experiences drifting between temporal categories more easily than they should. Your brain also has limited capacity for what's called source monitoring, the ability to remember not just that something happened, but when and where and under what circumstances. Source monitoring requires detailed contextual encoding, which requires energy and attention, both of which are scarce when you're fatigued. Without good source information, memories become decontextualized, floating in your mind as facts or impressions, without clear timestamps or location markers. And when a current experience resembles one of these decontextualized memories, the resemblance can trigger a familiarity signal without providing any information about where or when the original experience occurred. Your brain recognizes the pattern but can't place it in time, and in the absence of clear temporal information, the default interpretation often leans toward assuming it happened before, happened in the past, even though it might be happening for the first time right now. The thinning of temporal boundaries under fatigue isn't permanent. Sleep restores the systems involved in temporal organization, allows the hippocampus to complete its consolidation work, replenishes the metabolic resources the prefrontal cortex needs to function precisely, and generally re-establishes the clean separation between past and present that makes normal waking consciousness feel stable and oriented in time. After good sleep, déjà vu experiences typically decrease because the archivist returns to full function, filing things properly again, maintaining boundaries, keeping the timeline coherent. But during periods of extended fatigue, During weeks of insufficient sleep or chronic stress, the boundaries may remain thin for extended periods, and experiences of temporal confusion may become more frequent, more persistent. So when you're tired and déjà vu occurs, it's worth recognizing that the experience isn't mysterious or concerning, but simply a natural consequence of running complex temporal processing systems on insufficient resources. Your brain is still working, still encoding and retrieving, still trying to maintain the distinction between now and then, but it's doing so with dimmed lights and less precision, and sometimes in that dimness, the boundaries blur just enough for past and present to seem to occupy the same space. The feeling will pass as you rest. The boundaries will strengthen again, and the present will return to feeling firmly present, separated from the past by the clear, well-maintained borders that adequate rest allows your brain to sustain. But while you're tired, while the systems are running on low power, the past stays closer than it should. Memories surface without invitation. The present encodes weakly, and occasionally, in that state of thinned boundaries and weakened separation, a moment arrives that feels both new and old, both present and past, both happening now and remembered from before. Not because time has actually folded back on itself, but because fatigue has made the borders between different times permeable enough that crossing between them requires almost no effort, and your brain, tired as it is, occasionally crosses without meaning to, and stands for a moment in two times at once. Certain environments hold overlapping details, generic hallways, repeating architectural patterns, places designed to feel familiar. Your brain encodes them with less specificity because there's little unique to hold on to. When you return, or enter somewhere similar, the vague memory matches too easily. The system signals recognition not because it remembers this place, but because it remembers something close enough to confuse itself. Hotels are frequent triggers. Every hotel room follows the same basic template. Bed near the wall, television facing it, bathroom to one side, desk under the window, neutral colours, standard furniture. Your hippocampus tries to encode this space as unique, but there's nothing sufficiently distinctive to create a strong memory. The details blur together with dozens of other hotel rooms you've stayed in. The memory becomes generalized, a template rather than a specific instance. When you enter the next hotel room, the match is immediate. Not because you've been in this particular room, but because this room fits the template perfectly. The recognition system activates. Familiarity floods in, and sometimes the familiarity is strong enough to feel like actual memory. Airports function the same way. Long corridors with repeating gates, identical seating areas, the same shops in slightly different arrangements. Your brain encodes the pattern: gate area, walking path, waiting zone. But it doesn't encode which specific airport or which specific gate. The pattern is what gets stored, and patterns match promiscuously. Any airport can trigger the pattern. Any gate area feels familiar. The brain signals that you've been here before because structurally you have been, in a different airport, at a different time. But the similarity is close enough that the distinction collapses. Office buildings are particularly prone to this. Fluorescent lighting creates the same quality of illumination everywhere. Carpeted hallways absorb sound in predictable ways. Cubicles repeat in modular grids. Conference rooms differ only in size. The brain trying to encode an office space finds few anchors, few unique features, few details that mark this floor as different from any other floor. So the encoding is shallow, surface level, pattern-based rather than detail-based, and shallow encoding produces weak, vague memories that match easily with new but similar experiences. Schools do this too. Lockers in rows, classroom doors evenly spaced, tile floors with identical patterns. stairwells that look the same on every floor. Children moving through these spaces encode the general structure: hallway, classroom, stairs. But the specifics don't register strongly. Years later, entering a different school, the pattern reactivates. The brain says, "I know this place." And it does. It knows the pattern, just not this particular instance of it. Residential neighborhoods can trigger similar effects. Suburban streets with repeating house designs, similar landscaping, identical street layouts. Your brain encodes the neighborhood type: tree-lined street, two-story houses, driveways and sidewalks in standard configurations. But it doesn't necessarily encode which neighborhood. Driving through a new area that matches the template, the familiarity arrives unbidden. You feel like you've been on this street, turned this corner, seen this exact view. But you're responding to architectural and planning patterns, to design conventions that repeat across thousands of similar developments. The brain evolved to notice differences. Unique landmarks, distinctive features, anything that stands out from the background. These distinctive features become memory anchors. They help you remember specific places as separate from other places. But modern environments minimize distinctiveness. Chain stores look identical in different cities. Fast food restaurants maintain strict branding consistency. Shopping malls follow the same design principles. Housing developments use limited architectural vocabularies. Everything is standardized, optimized, made familiar on purpose. This standardization serves commercial and practical purposes, but it creates neural confusion. Your memory system can't distinguish between locations that are functionally identical, can't create separate, stable memories for places with no meaningful differences. So it creates one memory, one template, and applies it everywhere the template fits. Déjà vu in these spaces isn't malfunction. It's accurate pattern recognition applied to ambiguous input. Your brain correctly identifies that this space resembles other spaces. The resemblance is real. The problem is that resemblance gets interpreted as identity, as sameness rather than similarity. And sameness implies previous encounter, implies memory. Forests vary in species composition, density, light quality. Mountains have unique geological features. Coastlines differ in rock formation, sand type, tidal patterns. Natural spaces provide abundant, distinctive details. Details that create strong, specific memories. Memories that don't match other locations easily. People who spend time in varied natural environments report déjà vu less frequently. Not because their brains function differently, but because the environments they move through offer more distinctiveness, more memory anchors, more features that separate one experience from others. The feeling is strongest in transitional spaces, hallways between rooms, parking structures between buildings, waiting areas between destinations. These spaces are designed to be passed through, not inhabited. Design budgets are lower. Distinctiveness is sacrificed. Function dominates. Your brain barely encodes them, just enough to navigate, to know where you're going, not enough to remember clearly later. And these barely encoded spaces are perfect candidates for false familiarity. Vague memory meets vague current perception. The match happens easily, too easily. Lighting matters significantly. Certain qualities of light appear frequently across different locations. Afternoon sun at a particular angle. Fluorescent tubes at a specific color temperature. Dim ambient light in windowless spaces. Your brain associates these lighting conditions with many different places. The light triggers the associated memories, all of them at once. And the overlap creates confusion. Sound does this too. Air conditioning hum, distant traffic, muffled conversations. These acoustic patterns repeat endlessly. Your brain encodes them as contextual background, not tied to specific locations, floating free, ready to attach to any situation that sounds similar. When multiple generic features combine, similar architecture plus familiar lighting plus recognizable sounds, the compound match is powerful. Each element individually might not trigger familiarity, but together they create strong recognition. Recognition without clear source, without specific memory, just the overwhelming sense that this has happened before. The sense will weaken as you stay longer, as you notice details that don't match the template. As the space becomes more than just pattern, more specific, more itself. The generic fades, the particular emerges, and the déjà vu dissolves. But in that first moment of entering, when all you see is the pattern, when the details haven't differentiated yet, the familiarity can feel absolute, certain, like you've stood exactly here before, seen exactly this, lived exactly this moment. Not because you have, but because you've stood in pattern-matched spaces, seen template-matched scenes, lived through generic moments, enough times, that generic itself has become familiar. Stress changes how your brain timestamps experience. Under pressure, the amygdala takes over, encoding moments with heightened detail but less accuracy. Later, those moments feel dense, heavy, like they've been lived more than once. Anxiety doesn't just make time feel slower, it makes the present feel like it's already happened. The body prepares for what it fears by treating it as memory. Notice how your body feels when you're anxious, the tightness in your chest that arrives before conscious thought identifies danger, the quickening pulse that responds to threats both real and imagined, the shallow breathing that happens automatically when your nervous system decides something requires vigilance. These physical responses don't wait for your conscious mind to evaluate situations carefully. They emerge instantly, driven by subcortical structures like the amygdala that process emotional significance faster than cortical regions process detailed analysis. And when the amygdala activates strongly, when it floods your system with stress hormones and heightened arousal, it also changes how your hippocampus encodes what's happening, stamping experiences with emotional intensity that makes them feel more significant, more memorable, more vivid than neutral moments would feel. But intensity and accuracy aren't the same thing, and the vividly encoded anxious moments often contain temporal distortions, compression and expansion of duration, blurred boundaries between when something started and when it ended. Time becomes elastic under stress, stretching and contracting in ways that create confusion later when you try to remember the sequence of events. Think of emotional memory as being written in bolder ink than ordinary memory, each letter darker and more prominent, standing out against the page of daily experience with unusual clarity. The boldness serves a purpose. Evolution shaped your brain to remember threatening situations vividly so you can avoid them in the future, so the memory of danger becomes a learning tool that protects you. But the bold ink also obscures temporal precision, making it harder to see exactly when each letter was written, whether this word came before or after that one, whether the experience happened recently or long ago. The emotional weight dominates, and within that weight, the timeline becomes secondary, less important than the felt intensity of the memory itself. So when something in your present triggers the same emotional response, the same physiological arousal pattern, your amygdala recognizes the match immediately and activates the old memory, bringing it forward with all its bold intensity. And suddenly, the past and present are both vividly present in your awareness, both carrying the same emotional signature, and the distinction between them blurs. Which moment is now? which is then? The question becomes difficult to answer when both feel equally immediate, equally charged, equally real. Anxiety has a particular relationship with time that differs from other emotional states, a forward-looking quality that involves constant scanning for future threats, constant simulation of what might go wrong. And this future-focused worry paradoxically makes the present feel pre-experienced. When you're anxious about something that hasn't happened yet, your brain runs detailed simulations of the feared event, activating many of the same neural circuits that would fire if the event were actually occurring, generating sensory details and emotional responses that feel remarkably similar to real experience. These simulations get encoded in memory, even though they're imaginary, creating traces that resemble actual memories. And later, when similar situations arise, your brain retrieves these simulation memories and compares them to current reality. If the match is close, if what's happening now resembles what you anxiously imagined might happen, the recognition system signals that you've encountered this before, that this moment has already occurred, when actually you've only worried about it occurring, only simulated it mentally. But the simulation was vivid enough to create memory traces that now feel like real past experiences. The future you feared has arrived, and because you rehearsed it so thoroughly in anxious anticipation, it feels like repetition rather than first occurrence. Chronic stress compounds this effect by keeping your amygdala in a state of heightened reactivity, more sensitive to potential threats, more likely to activate strong emotional responses to ambiguous stimuli, more prone to encoding experiences as significant, even when they're mundane. Under sustained stress, your baseline arousal stays elevated. Your nervous system remains in a state of preparedness that was designed for brief emergencies, but instead becomes a continuous condition. And in this state, everything feels more intense, more important, more memorable than it actually is. The volume of experience gets turned up, emotional intensity amplified, and the amplification creates richer, denser memory traces that crowd together in storage without clear temporal separation. Days blur into each other because every day carries the same heightened emotional tone, the same stress signature, making it difficult to distinguish Tuesday from Thursday, last week from yesterday, creating a compressed temporal experience where recent and distant memories feel equally close because they're all stamped with the same elevated emotional intensity. And within that compression, déjà vu becomes more likely because the lack of clear temporal boundaries means any current experience can match multiple past experiences simultaneously, creating compound recognition signals that feel impossibly strong, like you've lived this exact moment not just once before, but many times. The multiplication of matches creates certainty that overwhelms rational evaluation, a feeling so strong it must be true, even though logically you know it can't be. The metaphor of bold ink begins to fade here into something more biological, more grounded in the actual chemistry of stress and its effects on neural encoding. When your amygdala responds to stress, it triggers the release of cortisol and norepinephrine, hormones that enhance memory consolidation in the hippocampus, making stressed experiences more likely to be remembered long-term than neutral experiences. This enhancement happens because remembering stressful events has survival value, allowing you to learn from danger and avoid it in the future. But the enhanced consolidation also makes these memories more accessible, more easily triggered, more likely to surface inappropriately during later experiences that bear even slight resemblance to the original stressful situation. The memory becomes overlearned, encoded so strongly that it can be activated by minimal cues, and when it activates, it brings with it the full emotional and physiological response of the original experience, creating a state where past stress and present moment merge into a single, overwhelming experience that feels both historical and immediate. People with anxiety disorders report significantly higher rates of déjà vu than the general population, a correlation that makes sense given how anxiety distorts temporal processing, creates vivid simulations that resemble memories, keeps the amygdala hyperactive, and the system primed for threat detection. The anxious brain is constantly comparing present circumstances to potential dangers, running pattern-matching operations at high speed with lowered thresholds for triggering recognition. And this state of heightened vigilance produces false matches more readily than a calm, relaxed state would. Every new situation gets screened against the database of feared outcomes, worried scenarios, catastrophic imaginings that have been rehearsed mentally but never actually experienced. And when current reality even vaguely resembles one of these imagined scenarios, the match registers as familiarity, as having been here before, when really you've only been here in fearful anticipation, in worried simulation, in the anxious preparation that characterized how you approached this moment before it arrived. The déjà vu in anxiety isn't about confused memory retrieval so much as about mistaking imagined futures for remembered pasts, about confusing preparation with experience. Emotional arousal also affects how you perceive duration in real time, making threatening or stressful moments seem to last longer than they actually do, a phenomenon demonstrated in numerous experiments where people overestimate the duration of fearful stimuli compared to neutral ones. This time dilation happens because the amygdala's activation increases the rate at which your brain samples incoming information, taking more frequent snapshots of experience during stress, and more snapshots create the subjective impression of longer duration, even though clock time passes at its normal rate. Later, when you remember the stressful event, the dense encoding created by those extra snapshots makes the memory feel heavy, packed with detail, as though it occupied more temporal space than it actually did. And this heaviness, this density, can create the sensation that you've lived through this moment multiple times, because the single actual occurrence left such a thick memory trace, recorded at such high resolution, that retrieving it feels like retrieving multiple separate events compressed together. One stressed moment becomes memory equivalent to several calm moments, taking up more space in your recalled timeline, and when you encounter similar situations later, the comparison between current experience and that densely encoded past can produce the strange conviction that this has happened before, multiple times, with impossible clarity. The conviction comes from accurate recognition of similarity, combined with distorted estimation of how many times the similarity has been encountered, the dense encoding creating an illusion of repetition where there was only intensely recorded singularity. As stress eases, as your nervous system returns to baseline arousal, the temporal distortions gradually resolve, the amygdala quiets, and allows the hippocampus to encode time more accurately. Emotional intensity decreases, and memories begin accumulating with clearer boundaries between them. Déjà vu experiences become less frequent because the system is no longer operating in a state that promotes temporal confusion. Rest helps, as does anything that reduces overall stress load and allows your brain to process experiences at a more measured pace without the constant urgency that stress imposes. The memories encoded during high-stress periods don't disappear, but they lose some of their inappropriate accessibility, stop surfacing unbidden during unrelated moments, settle into more appropriate temporal distance, where they can be recalled when relevant, but don't intrude constantly into present awareness. Time becomes less elastic, more stable, moving at a pace that feels predictable rather than chaotic. And within that stability, the distinction between now and then becomes clearer again, sharper, easier to maintain. The present returns to feeling present, uncontaminated by the dense emotional memories that stress had kept too close to consciousness. But during stress, during anxiety, during those periods when your amygdala dominates processing and emotional intensity overwhelms temporal precision, the present can feel perpetually familiar, perpetually repeated, as though you're living through moments you've already lived through many times before. Not because time has actually looped, not because you've genuinely encountered these situations repeatedly, but because stress encodes experience so intensely, simulates feared futures so vividly, and blurs temporal boundaries so thoroughly that the distinction between first occurrence and repetition, between imagination and memory, between present and past, becomes impossible to maintain with certainty. And in that impossibility, déjà vu thrives, fed by the temporal chaos that emotional arousal creates, by the dense memories and vivid simulations and hyperactive pattern matching that characterize a brain operating under sustained pressure. The feeling persists as long as the stress persists, as long as the system remains in that heightened state where time refuses to flow in orderly fashion, and every moment carries the weight of too much significance, too much intensity, too much resemblance to both feared futures and overwhelming pasts. Until rest comes, until the pressure eases, until the amygdala quiets and allows time to resume its more measured progression through distinct moments that stay properly separated in memory, rather than bleeding together into undifferentiated emotional density. And then the present, finally, becomes singular again, experienced once, encoded clearly, distinct from what came before and what might come after, no longer haunted by the impossible familiarity that stress creates when it warps the brain's sense of time. The moments return to their proper sequence, no longer compressed or repeated or confused with anxious simulations, just present, just now, just themselves, as time moves forward again without folding back on itself in the strange temporal loops that emotional intensity produces. There's a rhythm to how your brain updates itself about where you are in time. Tiny pulses, firing in sync, keep the past separate from now. But sometimes the rhythm skips. A gap appears, brief, invisible, and information slips through without a timestamp. What enters during that silence belongs to no clear moment, so the brain assigns it to the nearest one, a memory. Right now, beneath your awareness, populations of neurons in your hippocampus and cortex are firing in coordinated waves, not randomly, not continuously, in pulses. These pulses happen roughly 8 times per second, a frequency called Theta rhythm, and they create temporal windows that your brain uses to organize incoming information into discrete moments, rather than allowing experience to blur into undifferentiated flow. Each pulse opens a window. Information arriving during that window gets grouped together, tagged as belonging to the same moment. Then the window closes. The next pulse opens a new window, and information arriving in the new window gets tagged as belonging to a different subsequent moment. Think of these pulses as the tick marks on a timeline, each one marking where one moment ends and another begins, the rhythm providing structure that prevents experiences from running together without boundaries. Without this rhythmic organization, your brain would have no clear way to separate what just happened from what's happening now, from what happened a few seconds ago. Everything would exist in an eternal present, without sequence or order. The theta rhythm solves this problem by imposing temporal discreteness onto what would otherwise be continuous sensory flow, chunking experience into manageable units that can be compared, ordered, and stored with appropriate temporal relationships to each other. Most of the time, this chunking works seamlessly, the rhythm steady and reliable, each pulse arriving on schedule to mark the passage from one moment to the next. But the rhythm isn't perfectly regular. It fluctuates. Sometimes it speeds slightly, sometimes it slows, and occasionally, rarely, it skips. The skip creates a gap where no temporal window exists, a brief silence in the system that normally provides continuous updating about temporal position, and information arriving during that gap has nowhere to go, no open window to receive it, no pulse to assign it a proper timestamp. The information still gets processed. Your sensory systems don't stop working just because the timing system hiccuped, but it arrives in your awareness without the usual temporal tagging that would mark it as belonging to now, to this specific present moment, clearly separated from all previous moments. Instead, it floats, unanchored, and when the rhythm resumes and the next pulse arrives, that unanchored information needs to be assigned to something, needs to be placed somewhere in your experiential timeline, even though it missed its proper temporal window. And often, Perhaps because of how memory retrieval pathways are structured, the brain assigns this unanchored information to the past rather than the present, treating it as something being recalled rather than something being experienced for the first time. The gap in timing becomes interpreted as temporal distance, as though the information is arriving late from memory storage rather than arriving slightly mistimed from current perception. The metaphor of tick marks and windows begins to dissolve into something more specific, more grounded in measurable neural activity. Researchers can record theta rhythm directly using electroencephalography, watching the oscillations rise and fall in regular waves across the hippocampus and entorhinal cortex, and they found that these oscillations coordinate activity across distributed brain regions, ensuring that different areas processing different aspects of experience, visual cortex handling sight, auditory cortex handling sound, prefrontal cortex handling context, all stay synchronized in time. The synchronization matters because it allows your brain to bind together the different features of a single moment into a coherent experience, rather than having vision and sound and thought arrive at different times and create a fragmented, confusing awareness. The theta rhythm is the metronome that keeps everything aligned, that makes it possible for you to experience reality as unified and temporally ordered, rather than as a chaotic jumble of asynchronous sensations. But metronomes can skip beats, especially biological ones that depend on precise coordination of millions of neurons all firing together. And when neurons are fatigued or distracted, or dealing with competing demands, the coordination can falter. A small population of neurons might fire out of phase. A critical connection might transmit signals slightly slower than usual. A neuromodulator like acetylcholine, which helps regulate theta rhythm, might be temporarily depleted in one region. Any of these small disruptions can cause the rhythm to stutter, to hesitate, to skip a beat in a way that creates a temporal gap. The gap lasts only milliseconds, far too brief for conscious detection, but milliseconds are enough to cause information to arrive in the wrong window, to slip between the pulses that normally catch and timestamp everything. And once information has slipped through, once it's lost its proper temporal tag, the brain has to guess where it belongs, has to retroactively assign it to some moment, even though it arrived in the silence between moments. The guess tends toward the past. This makes a certain kind of sense. Information arriving without a timestamp could logically be either delayed current perception or retrieved old memory, and your brain defaults to interpreting ambiguous temporal signals as memory rather than perception, because memory retrieval is a more common explanation for information arriving out of sequence. When you're walking through the world, most of what you experience arrives in proper timing, synchronized with the theta pulses, clearly marked as present. But memory retrieval happens constantly too, thoughts surfacing from past experiences without being directly triggered by current perception. And these retrieved memories naturally arrive without current moment timestamps because they belong to different times. So when the brain encounters information without a clear temporal tag, memory retrieval is a reasonable hypothesis, and the system applies that hypothesis automatically, unconsciously, labeling the unanchored information as recalled rather than perceived, which creates déjà vu when the information is actually coming from current perception that just happened to slip through a gap in the timing system. You're seeing something for the first time, but because it arrived during a silent gap between theta pulses, your brain tags it as remembered, as something being retrieved from the past. And the contradiction between knowing logically that this is new and feeling absolutely that it's familiar creates the characteristic unsettling sensation of déjà vu. Studies using direct brain stimulation have demonstrated this connection between theta rhythm disruption and déjà vu experiences. When researchers apply electrical stimulation to the hippocampus in ways that interfere with normal theta oscillations, participants reliably report feelings of familiarity and déjà vu, even for completely novel stimuli they've never encountered before. The disruption of temporal organization alone is sufficient to produce the feeling, without any actual memory confusion or pattern matching errors. Simply breaking the rhythm that normally timestamps experience causes the brain to misattribute new information to old memory, demonstrating that déjà vu can arise purely from timing problems rather than content problems, from structure rather than retrieval. The rhythm varies naturally across different states of consciousness. During alert waking, theta is relatively fast and regular. During drowsiness, it slows and becomes more variable. During deep sleep, it's largely absent, replaced by other rhythms. And during transitions between these states, the moments just before falling asleep, the period just after waking, theta can become erratic, stuttering in ways that make temporal organization less reliable. This is why déjà vu sometimes occurs during these transitional periods, when you're not quite fully awake or not quite fully asleep, when the system that keeps time organized is shifting between different operating modes, and the shifts create brief instabilities in the rhythm. Certain drugs and neurological conditions also affect theta rhythm in ways that increase déjà vu frequency. Temporal lobe epilepsy, for instance, involves abnormal electrical activity in regions where theta is generated, and people with this condition often experience intense, frequent déjà vu as part of their seizure aura. The abnormal activity disrupts normal rhythmic organization, creating repeated gaps and stutters in the timing system, and each disruption produces an opportunity for information to slip through untimestamped and be misattributed to memory. Similarly, substances that affect cholinergic signaling, which modulates theta rhythm, can increase or decrease déjà vu frequency depending on whether they enhance or disrupt the normal oscillatory pattern. The more unstable the rhythm, the more frequently gaps occur, the more often information loses its temporal tag, and the more déjà vu experiences emerge from the system's attempts to retroactively timestamp what should have been stamped in real time. For most people, most of the time, the rhythm holds steady. The pulses arrive regularly. The windows open and close on schedule. Information gets timestamped accurately. Past stays separate from present. The system maintains the temporal structure that makes coherent experience possible. But occasionally, the rhythm falters. A pulse arrives late. A window stays closed when it should open. A gap appears, and information slips through the gap, arriving without its proper temporal tag, floating unanchored in your awareness until the brain decides where to place it. The decision happens quickly, automatically, without conscious input. And often the decision is, this belongs to the past. This is memory. This has happened before. Even though it hasn't. Even though it's happening now, for the first time, in the present moment. The only thing that's happened before is the gap, the silence, the missed pulse that left this experience unanchored. But your brain doesn't know about the gap, can't detect its own timing errors, doesn't realize the rhythm skipped. It only knows that information arrived without a proper timestamp, and in the absence of a proper timestamp, memory becomes the default explanation. And so the present, just for a moment, feels like the past. Not because of what's happening, but because of when the timing system registered that it was happening, or rather, failed to register. In the silence, in the gap, where the rhythm should have been. The rhythm will resume. The pulses will return to their regular pattern. The windows will open and close as they should. And the information arriving after the gap will be properly timestamped again, clearly marked as present, as now, as this moment distinct from all others. The déjà vu will fade as quickly as it appeared, lasting only as long as the echo of that brief silence in the system that holds time together. You don't need to resolve why a moment felt familiar. the feeling fades as quickly as it came, leaving no mark, no consequence. Your brain continues its work, encoding, predicting, comparing, without needing to explain itself. Déjà vu isn't a problem to solve. It's just a reminder that memory and experience were never as separate as they seemed. Throughout this journey through the biology of impossible familiarity, we've watched signals arrive out of sequence, patterns match too easily, temporal boundaries thin and blur, rhythms skip their beats. And through it all, your brain has continued doing what it was designed to do, making sense of continuous sensory flow, organizing chaos into order, building coherent experience from fragments that arrive scattered across time and neural space. The systems we've explored, the perirhinal cortex measuring novelty, the hippocampus binding context, the dual pathways conducting at different speeds, the theta rhythm marking temporal boundaries. These aren't separate mechanisms, but interconnected processes that work together, mostly successfully, to give you a stable, oriented awareness of when things happen and whether they've happened before. And when these systems occasionally produce déjà vu, when the timing slips, or the patterns match incorrectly, or the boundaries dissolve momentarily, it's not a failure, but a glimpse into the ordinary mechanics of temporal processing, a brief visibility of operations that usually remain hidden beneath the smooth surface of consciousness. The strangeness you feel during déjà vu isn't the brain malfunctioning, it's the brain functioning in a slightly unusual configuration, one that makes visible the constant work of distinguishing past from present, memory from perception, repetition from novelty. Think of your experience of time as a river, flowing steadily from past through present toward future, carrying experiences along its current, and your sense of being present is like floating on that river, moving with it, always positioned at the leading edge where the river meets what hasn't happened yet. Most of the time, the current is smooth, predictable, and you float forward without questioning your position, without noticing the mechanics of how the river flows or what keeps you oriented within it. But occasionally the current eddies, swirls back on itself briefly, and in that moment of turbulence, you feel the strange sensation of moving forward, while also encountering something that feels like it's coming from behind, from upstream, from the past you thought you'd already passed. The eddy resolves quickly, the current smooths out again, and you continue floating forward. But the brief turbulence revealed something about the river, that its flow isn't as simple as it appears, that beneath the surface there are currents moving at different speeds and in different directions, creating complexity you don't usually notice. Déjà vu is one of those eddies, a moment when the hidden complexity becomes perceptible, when the work of maintaining temporal flow becomes briefly visible before disappearing again into the background of ordinary experience. And then the metaphor dissolves, leaving just the biological reality. Neurons firing, synapses transmitting, neurotransmitters binding to receptors, electrical patterns propagating through tissue, chemical gradients establishing themselves across membranes, proteins folding and unfolding, genes expressing and repressing, all the molecular machinery operating without your guidance or awareness to create what you experience as consciousness, as selfhood, as the continuous thread of identity moving through time. These biological processes don't care about meaning or significance, or whether you understand them. They simply continue, moment after moment, maintaining the systems that allow you to exist as an experiencing entity, to have thoughts and feelings and memories and predictions, to navigate the world as though you know where and when you are, even though that knowledge is constantly being constructed and reconstructed by mechanisms you can't directly access. Déjà vu happens within this machinery, emerges from its operations, and fades back into it without requiring your intervention or comprehension. The systems correct themselves, recalibrate, return to their typical patterns, and the feeling passes not because you've solved it, but because the temporary configuration that produced it has resolved itself at a level far beneath conscious awareness. What remains after déjà vu fades is perhaps more interesting than the phenomenon itself. A subtle reminder that your experience of reality is mediated, constructed, assembled from pieces that don't always fit together perfectly, and that the seamless, coherent awareness you usually inhabit is an achievement, an accomplishment of neural systems working to create unity from multiplicity, order from potential chaos. You assume you experience the world directly, immediately, but every sensation passes through layers of processing. Every perception is shaped by prediction and expectation. Every memory is reconstructed rather than retrieved intact. And the present moment you inhabit is actually a narrow window of integrated information that your brain has decided to call now, even though the information comprising it arrived at different times and was processed at different speeds. Living inside this constructed reality usually feels effortless, natural, but déjà vu briefly pulls back the curtain and shows you that effortlessness requires enormous effort, that naturalness is engineered, that the simple experience of being present in a moment involves staggering complexity operating beneath awareness. And then the curtain closes again. The effort becomes invisible once more, and you return to the comfortable illusion that experience is simple, direct, unmediated. The brain doesn't require you to understand these processes to keep running them, doesn't need your conscious participation in the constant work of temporal organization, pattern recognition, memory encoding, prediction generation, and all the other operations that create your subjective experience of moving through time. These processes are automatic, deeply embedded in neural architecture shaped by millions of years of evolution, refined through countless generations to produce organisms that can navigate complex environments, remember important information, anticipate future events, and generally behave as though they have reliable knowledge about when things happen and what those happenings mean. You are the beneficiary of this ancient engineering, inheriting systems you didn't design and don't fully understand, but that work remarkably well most of the time, giving you a stable, coherent experience of reality that allows you to function, to learn, to plan, to remember, to be. And when those systems occasionally produce experiences like déjà vu, experiences that feel impossible or paradoxical or unsettling, you don't need to fix them or understand them completely. You can simply notice them, appreciate them as brief windows into the hidden complexity that sustains your awareness, and then let them pass as your brain returns to its typical operating patterns without requiring your conscious intervention. So when déjà vu arrives in the future, as it likely will from time to time throughout your life, you might recognize it not as something wrong or mysterious, but as something ordinary, a natural consequence of biological systems doing their work under slightly unusual conditions. A moment when timing mechanisms briefly misalign, or pattern matching becomes too liberal, or temporal boundaries thin just enough to create confusion. The recognition might make the experience less unsettling, might allow you to observe it with curiosity rather than concern, to notice the sensation of impossible familiarity without needing to explain it or resolve it, to simply experience it as one of the many strange and interesting things that brains sometimes do. The feeling will pass on its own timeline, according to its own biological resolution, without requiring anything from you except perhaps a moment of noticing, a brief acknowledgement that something unusual just happened in the machinery of your temporal awareness. And then it will be gone, and you'll continue forward, moving through time in the ordinary way, with the systems that briefly produce strangeness returning to their usual work of keeping you oriented, grounded, present. Your brain will keep encoding new experiences, keep comparing them to stored patterns, keep predicting what comes next, keep organizing information into temporal sequence, keep maintaining the boundaries between past and present, Keep firing its rhythmic pulses that mark the passage of moments. Keep conducting signals at varying speeds through different pathways. Keep adjusting for fatigue and stress and distraction. Keep building the continuous thread of awareness that allows you to feel like yourself, like an entity that persists through time, rather than being recreated from scratch each moment. All of this will continue whether you understand it or not, whether you think about it or not, because these are not processes you control consciously. They are the foundation upon which consciousness itself rests, the scaffolding that makes experience possible, operating always in the background while you attend to the foreground of whatever occupies your awareness in any given moment. And occasionally that background will make itself briefly visible, will produce a sensation like déjà vu that reminds you it exists, that hints at the complexity underlying simple experience, and then it will recede again into invisibility, into the unconscious operations that sustain you without announcement or acknowledgement. And so we return to where we began, to the recognition that arrives too early, the feeling of familiarity that floods in before a moment finishes forming, the strange sensation of standing inside a memory that hasn't been made yet. We've traced this feeling through neural pathways and timing systems, through pattern matching and prediction errors, through stress and fatigue and architectural similarity, through the silence in rhythms and the delay between sensing and knowing. And what we've found is not a single explanation, but a network of possibilities, a web of interconnected processes, any of which might produce the experience of déjà vu, depending on context and circumstance, and the particular configuration of neural activity in any given moment. The brain, as always, remains more complex than any complete explanation can capture, more subtle in its operations than any description can fully convey. And déjà vu stands as a reminder of that complexity, that subtlety, that fundamental unknowability at the heart of subjective experience. You experience consciousness from the inside, as a unity, as something simple and immediate. But the mechanisms creating that experience are neither simple nor immediate. They are elaborate, distributed, dependent on precise coordination across multiple timescales and spatial scales, vulnerable to disruptions that usually have no lasting consequence, but that sometimes create these brief, strange moments when the machinery becomes visible to itself. When the system that generates experience produces an experience of itself, however briefly, however incompletely, when the process of being present creates a sensation that the present has already been. And with that understanding, or perhaps with that appreciation for the limits of understanding, we can rest in the knowledge that déjà vu requires nothing from us. No solution, no interpretation, no concern. It arrives, it passes, it leaves us unchanged except perhaps slightly more aware of the invisible work being done constantly to maintain our sense of existing in time, of being oriented in the continuous flow of experience, of knowing with reasonable certainty what is now and what is memory. That work continues even now, as you rest here, as these words fade into silence, as your awareness drifts towards sleep or toward whatever comes next in your day. The systems persist, the processes continue, and you float forward on their operations, carried through time by mechanisms older than language, older than consciousness itself, ancient biological rhythms that have been running since long before you existed and will continue running long after. The present remains present. The past remains past. And the boundary between them, though occasionally blurred, holds firm enough to let you know where you are and when you are, and that this moment, this particular now, is yours and no one else's, and is happening for the first time and only time, even if, just occasionally, it doesn't feel that way. Thank you for resting here with the sleepy biologist, for allowing these explorations of the hidden biology beneath everyday experience, for being part of this quiet space where science and rest meet. If this journey through the mechanisms of déjà vu brought you something useful, some understanding, some curiosity, some comfort in knowing how these strange experiences emerge from ordinary biological processes, please consider supporting this work by subscribing to the channel, leaving a like to help others find these videos, or if you're able and willing, joining as a channel member or contributing through super thanks. Your support allows this space to continue existing, allows more topics to be explored with the same attention to scientific accuracy and calming presentation, allows the sleepy biologist to keep creating content that takes biology seriously while also taking rest seriously, recognizing that learning and sleeping aren't opposed, but can complement each other beautifully when the approach is right. And if you'd like to share where you're listening from tonight, what time it is in your part of the world, or whether déjà vu is something you experience often or rarely, the comments are always open. A quiet place where this community gathers to share experiences, to ask questions, to connect over the strange and wonderful biology we all share. Whether you're falling asleep now or listening during a quiet moment in your day, whether you're alone or near others, whether this is your first time here or you've been listening for years, thank you for being here, for bringing your attention and your rest to this space, for allowing biology to be both fascinating and calming, both intellectually engaging and perfectly suited for drifting away. Rest well. Let the systems continue their work. Let the present stay present and the past stay past. And when they occasionally blur, when déjà vu arrives unbidden and strange, remember it's just your brain, doing what brains do, working hard to organize experience, occasionally making small errors in that organization, then correcting itself and carrying you forward through time, one moment after another. Until next time, sweet dreams, good rest, and may your present moments feel clearly present, your memories stay where they belong, and your sense of time flow smoothly and steadily forward. Good night.